How often do you teach your patients how to read a food label? Now, if you just thought, ooh, not as often as I should, don't worry, you're not alone. Maybe you didn't get great training on how to explain labels in a way that's practical. Maybe you feel like it's too complicated. Or maybe, like so many of us, you just don't have the time. Now, it's been a while since I've done an episode like this where I give you a sneak peek into one of our Nutrition Grand Rounds webinars. In this presentation, we walked through exactly how to teach label reading in clinic without overwhelming your patient or running over time. I'm Colleen, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. I'm so grateful to have had Alexandria Hardy teach us all about label reading. She's the owner of Pennsylvania Nutrition Services, a seasoned dietitian with over 15 years of experience, and a health writer who brings a down-to-earth, practical lens to everything she teaches. So this episode is a clip-style preview of what members of Nutrition Grand Rounds learned last month. Today, you'll hear what patients are looking for on a label, and it's actually not what you think. My favorite teaching trick, the 5-20 rule, that makes label reading so easy. A surprising way to help patients interpret the ingredient list, even if they don't understand those big words. And how front-of-package claims like multigrain, reduced sodium, and added fiber can totally mislead even the most well-intentioned shoppers. Now, if you've never heard of Nutrition Grand Rounds, it's my monthly webinar membership for clinicians who want real evidence-based nutrition education that they can use in clinic. These presentations go into much more detail than my podcast episodes do, and we've covered topics like GLP-1s and nutrition, bone health, mental health, and most recently, today's topic, label reading for your patients. So if you want access to all of the previous presentations, the slide decks, and more, just head over to nutritiongrandrounds.com and join us. Our next webinar will be June 11th, and we'll be talking about fiber, prebiotics, and gut health. You won't want to miss it. Now let's get into the episode. So when you ask a patient what they look at on a food label, you probably expect to hear sugar or calories, but in this first clip, you're going to hear 3 things that patients are actually looking at, according to research. And trust me, these might surprise you. You'll also hear why knowing who's in front of you matters just as much as what you're teaching them, because label reading isn't one size fits all. It needs to reflect your patient's goals, their resources, and what actually matters to them. Let's take a listen.
Oftentimes people will say like, oh, I'm looking at calories. Oh, I'm looking at sugar. Oh, I'm looking at total fat. But then when I ask them, oh, okay, so you look at sugar on the label, like, do you try to stay below a certain amount of like grams of sugar per day? Is there a percentage of sugar you're looking at? And they have no idea. They're like, I don't know. I just know I shouldn't have as much. And so it's like, okay, that gives me like a great jumping off point, right? But then when I looked at the research, there's a couple of great articles published in Nutrients and ResearchGate, and they found that people were actually, first of all, looking at expiration dates was their number one item. So that could be something great to touch on too, just making sure that people know the difference between best by, sell by dates, because that can cause confusion. And they also found that people were looking at the total calories and the serving size, which is a great place to start. And practically when I'm working with clients, I do like to point out the serving size just as a way to say like, hey, for instance, I've got these frosted lemon Cheerios here. And when I look at the size, I see the serving size is 1 cup. And then I'll say, like, how do you think your cereal that you pour yourself, lines up to that? And really, it often depends on what type of bowl they're using. If they're using a soup bowl, they're probably eating quite a bit more than 1 cup. If they're using a smaller bowl, or some people eat cereal out of mugs, or they're just grabbing a handful, the portion size might be a little different. And so they updated the serving size to be 2/3 of a cup because that was a little bit closer, a little bit more reflective of what the average serving size was. Okay. And so that's all really a serving size is. It's just 1 serving of the product that they think most Americans would be eating. So it's not the same thing necessarily as a portion size, which is the amount of food that you're actually eating. And so we're never using this information to shame a patient or to tell them they're eating too much or too little, but it's just a way to help them get like that good mental picture in their mind of like what a serving actually is. And then the third thing they were looking at was ingredient lists. So maybe a little bit different than what you and I are initially drawn to when we are teaching these food labels. Also, in terms of who is looking at labels, oftentimes, according to the research, it is women. over men. It is people with higher education, so maybe a college degree or another advanced degree. And then it's often people that have more expendable income. And so I don't know if this resonates with any of you, but I know for some of my lower income clients, parsing a food label is not the number one thing they're looking at. They're more concerned with maybe, am I going to be able to, put food on the table or put enough food on the table? And so it's important just to recognize that and to be able to tailor your conversations to your patient population.
Okay, this next part is one of my favorite label reading shortcuts to teach, and it's something I guarantee you'll start using with your patients right away. It's all about the percent daily value. That column that most people skip right over because, well, percentages are confusing. But once you learn this 5-20 rule, it becomes so much easier. Not only does it make nutrition labels feel way less overwhelming, it also helps your patients focus on the one number that actually matters most to them. So whether you're working with someone who has high blood pressure, diabetes, or maybe just wants to boost their protein intake, this is a tool that meets them where they are and builds confidence instead of confusion. Let's listen in.
So this is my number one favorite trick that I use all the time across the board with all of my patients, regardless of what they are seeing me for. And it is that percent daily value. And a lot of people, I think, just skip right over that because percentages are confusing and they don't know how that measures in or how that factors in. So a little history here. This percent daily value is based on just 2,000 calorie diet because that is just kind of our standard diet that we are operating off of here in America. And so when we're looking at that, like total fat 8 grams is 10% daily value. So that's 10% daily value of a 2,000 calorie diet. Okay, but that's as much math as we need to do. So what I will tell people is if something has 5% or less daily value, it's going to be low and not particular nutrient. So to use this example here, I'm skimming the label and I'm seeing, oh, okay, saturated fat has 5%. So I know this item is low in saturated fat. Oh, 0% cholesterol. So this is an item that is low in cholesterol. Now, on the opposite end, if an item has 20% or more of a nutrient, that means it's high in that nutrient. So here I'm going, okay, so let's see, 20% added sugar. So this is a product that is higher in added sugars. 20% calcium. Okay, this is also a product that's high in calcium, which is maybe great depending on what my goals are. 45% iron. So this is a high iron product. So that could be really helpful if you have patients that maybe are anemic or that are borderline and that are just, or maybe are plant-based and they're looking to include higher iron sources in their diet. So this is how you can use that as a teaching tool. And then everything that falls within that 5 to 20%, I just say it's mid-level. And the way that this is most useful and most impactful, I think, is if you are able to have some products that are similar in front of you and you're able to walk them through with your clients. So like, for example, can we compare a couple of different types of pasta or crackers or cereal? Because that way we're staying within the same type of food, but you're allowing your clients to see like, oh, okay, so this one is actually like much higher in sodium than this one is. So maybe I want to choose the lower sodium product. Or, oh, this product has, 5% more carbohydrates than the other. And, I have type 2 diabetes, so maybe I want to choose the lower carbohydrate product. And so you can use it in a variety of ways, but it's really, really helpful for just like that quick glance at the supermarket. And something else I like to tell my clients is it can get overwhelming to look at all of these numbers, right? All of these percentages. So I always try to help them identify just one thing to look at first. So if you have a client, with hypertension, maybe they are really focused in on sodium. If you have a client who's battling like an elevated LDL or just like general high cholesterol, maybe we are looking at the saturated fat first. If you have a client that is struggling with gestational diabetes or type 2 diabetes, maybe we're looking at carbohydrates and then maybe also adding in fiber for them just as a little bonus. If I'm working with like a plant-based client, I'm looking at maybe their calcium, vitamin D, or iron. And then if you're looking at someone who just wants to, build muscle mass, maybe we're looking at protein. So it really can be interpreted and applied in a lot of different ways.
Now, if your patients find food labels confusing, the ingredient list can feel even more intimidating. But in this next clip, you'll hear a simple way to help them make sense of it, starting with just the first 3 ingredients. You'll also get an important reminder about that classic advice, if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. I hate that. It sounds catchy, but it's actually not always true. And as clinicians, we need to help our patients understand what those big, intimidating words actually mean, because sometimes they're just fancy names for nutrients that we want them to get. So let's take a closer look at the ingredient list and how to teach it in a way that sticks.
All right, we're going to transition a little bit now to turning the package and looking just at that ingredient list. And so these are just a couple of examples here of tomato paste. And you can see that there is a big difference in ingredients. So the one can just has tomatoes and that's it. And then our other can has quite a few ingredients. So tomato puree, high fructose corn syrup, and spices would be the top 3 ingredients there. And I usually encourage people to just focus on those top 3 because ingredients are listed in order of weight. And so if we're only looking at those top 3, that gives us an idea of like what most of the product is made of. And so in both cases, it is tomatoes, which is excellent, right? Because if we're getting tomato paste, that's what we really want to see as our number 1 product. But then you see on the second one, ooh, high fructose corn syrup. Okay, maybe I am someone that needs to watch my blood sugar a little bit. So maybe I'm just going to choose the product that's just tomatoes. And so depending on who your client is and if they prefer looking at words over numbers, this can be another great teaching tool just to help them interpret the label in a slightly different way. I think we've probably all heard, the piece of advice before, like, oh, if you can't pronounce it, you don't want to eat it. And I think that's true to a point, right? Because ideally we would recognize every single thing on our food label, but sometimes there are things like listed, like in this example, like, ascorbic acid. Well, that's just a form of vitamin C, right? But the lay consumer might not know that. And so I think sometimes we have to just be careful as clinicians to say like, oh, if you don't recognize it, you can't pronounce it, don't eat it, because that's not always true. So that's just a little piece of advice or like a little myth that I hear often that I always have to say, well, let me push back just a little bit. Or like riboflavin, for example. Well, that's a B vitamin. We actually do need that. And that's found in a lot of fortified foods. So just use your, common sense clinician hat there.
Okay, have you ever had a patient hold up a box of something and they say, but it says healthy right here on the front? Yeah, that health halo can be super misleading, and patients don't always know what to look for beyond the big, bold claims on the front of the package. In this next clip, Alexandria breaks down some of the most common front-of-label marketing tricks, from multigrain bread that's really just white flour with a tan, to protein bars that shout about vitamins but they sneak in saturated fat. She also walks us through how to help our patients understand certain claims like no nitrates or reduced sodium, and that they don't always mean what we think they mean. This is a gold mine for clearing up confusion and helping your patients learn to flip the package over with confidence. So let's take a listen.
Okay, so we're going to talk about front of package marketing tricks, because I don't know about you, but before I went through school, I had no idea that these were all like legally regulated terms. And I thought that manufacturers could just kind of put whatever they wanted on there, and they can to an extent, but there really are, some specific claims that are associated with like legal definitions here. And so just in general, front of package marketing would be claims like, natural, healthy. I think we've all seen examples of this before. But oftentimes, I find that anything on front of package is made to help a product look as healthy and as appealing as possible, right? Because again, these are marketing tricks, right? So here are a couple label claims in particular that I wanted to dig into a little bit. So the first one is multigrain. And so I just put a general, store example of like a multigrain bread here. But when I used to teach grocery store tours, this is something that would trip people up quite often in the bakery aisle, because they would see multigrain and oftentimes the bread would look a little darker than like just a regular white bread. And they would think, oh, this is so healthy. This must be the same thing as whole grain. And sometimes it is, but often it isn't. And so again, that's when we're going back to that first ingredient on the nutrition facts panel, looking at that ingredient list, and we are saying, okay, is the first ingredient multigrain flour? Is it enriched flour? Is it 100% whole wheat flour, which is ideally what we're aiming for? Because oftentimes multigrain bread is just white flour that has had nutrients added into it. So really we're looking for 100% whole wheat, 100% whole grain to be like our first ingredient there, regardless of what front of package says. That's what we're looking for on the back. Second of all, no nitrates or nitrites. So that's another one sometimes that, people get really hung up on, and they think like, oh, okay, so if it has no nitrates or nitrites, like it must be a low sodium choice. And those things don't necessarily correspond. So going back to that label, doing a little bit sodium education can help. Same thing with reduced sodium. So there are differences in foods that are no sodium low sodium and reduced sodium. And so depending on your client's needs, I would always ask them, are we trying to stay below a certain amount of sodium? So for example, like 150 milligrams of sodium is oftentimes like what I will recommend for like a client on a low sodium diet. That doesn't necessarily line up with what reduced means. And so that's, again, going back to the back of the package, using that percent daily value or using those grams if you have a certain amount that you've set for your clients and going through that with them. I don't know if anyone is an elder millennial like me and grew up on Sunny D, but you can also see in that very, very tiny label, it says 100% vitamin C. So it doesn't tell you it's high in sugar. It's just saying, oh, it has 100% vitamin C. This is such a healthy choice, which is, I think, why my parents bought it for us all the time. But you can see then, like, high in added sugars, it's 24% your daily value of added sugar in an 8-ounce serving. So that's quite a bit. We've got our Special K protein bars here, and you can see on the front, they are really advertising that protein front and center with 12 grams. We've got a vitamin D claim in the corner, and I think most people just naturally associate Special K with maybe a lower calorie option. But what they're not telling you, that it's also high in saturated fat. Okay, and so if we drop down here, it's 20% daily value of saturated fat in this Special K bar here. And then finally, made with extra fiber. I think this is the most pertinent one to the food and drink market that I am seeing today. Our sodas have prebiotic fiber in them now. Do they need to? I don't necessarily think so. That doesn't mean that they're a healthy or a better choice for us just because they have fiber. And so doing a little bit of education on the different types of fiber, for instance, soluble fiber is more slowly absorbed. It's going to keep you satiated or full longer. So you can think of all of those S's. Versus insoluble fiber, which is going to help keep you regular. And so, for example, inulin is a great example of a fiber that is often added to different foods and products, and that's a type of insoluble fiber. And so I always like to just remind people, like, do you remember when Fiber One became really, really popular, like 15 years ago? And I would have clients that would eat like multiple Fiber One products in a day, and then they would be in the bathroom because they would be experiencing like diarrhea, constipation, different GI side effects, depending on like what the product was and how much they had eaten. And so I like to just remind them, hey, extra fiber doesn't always mean high quality fiber or the best fiber. We want to get our fiber, from fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans and lentils. And we ideally want a balance of that soluble and insoluble fiber.
All right, I hope this gave you some fresh ideas for how to break down food labels in a way that's practical, non-judgmental, and actually sticks with your patients. Here are 3 things I hope you remember from today. Number 1, start with what matters to the patient. Whether it's their condition, their goals, their lived experience, don't try to cover the whole label in one visit. Number 2, use shortcuts like the 5-20 rule to simplify things and build confidence. Number 3, always flip the package over. Front of label claims can be misleading. The real information is on the back. Now, if you want to hear the full Nutrition Grand Rounds presentation with the slides and get access to all of our past webinars on GLP-1s, bone health, and mental health, head over to nutritiongrandrounds.com and sign up. And if you want some more information on label reading tips, I wrote a full blog post recapping today's key tips and other strategies. You can find the link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you enjoy my podcast as much as I do. And as always, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time. I'll see you next time.